Hi all. I'm sorry again for missing class this afternoon. Was able to be here for the plumbers. That was important, but it definitely set us behind a little bit. So I'm going to split up the presentation I was hoping to do in class today and the discussion I was hoping to have in class today over two short videos. And hopefully you'll get the chance to check these out before we meet again on Thursday, and I'll be happy to take any questions on these ideas then. So without further ado, let's jump in to a more in-depth discussion of the Spartans. So before we get into talking about Spartan culture, let's get a sense of where the Spartans were located. So you can see the red dot on our screen here that is demarcating the city-state of Sparta. And very quickly, I am saying city-state, and the term in Greek is polis, P-O-L-I-S, and many polises together are called polis. So you might have seen that terminology in your reading from Pomeroy. City-state is different from just a city or just a state in that each city has its own system of government. So even though we're looking at many polis in mainland Greece, on the Greek islands, and on the western coast of modern-day Turkey, which we'll call Asia Minor, even though they all identified as Greek, even though culturally they all were Greek and they spoke Greek, they did not think of themselves as a Greek nation. That came much later in Greek history. So all of these various cities were entities unto themselves with their own municipalities. You'll also notice that the Greek city-states are taking up a fair amount of space, a fair amount of land. So if we're looking where Sparta is, that part of Greece is called the Peloponnese, or the Peloponnesian Peninsula. So you can see some other famous cities like Olympia, Argos, and Mycenae, Troezen. You might remember some of these names from the stories about our heroes. Mainland Greece is a little farther north, and of course we have Athens here, Marathon, Plataea, Thebes. These are names, Salamis. These are some names that will become a little bit more familiar to you as we talk about the Persian Wars. So Sparta, what I wanted to point out to you is that Sparta is on the southern part of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and you'll remember from your reading too that Sparta tried very hard to gain control of much of the southern part of the Peloponnese. So you can see on the map that this is marked Laconia. All right, so this is the Laconian Plains, and here you see Messene, which is the location where the Messenian Wars took place between Messene and Sparta in the 7th century BCE. So Sparta really was able to take over a large amount of land in comparison to some of the other powerful polis like Athens. You can see that Athens has control of Attica, but Attica is not nearly as large as Laconia. So Sparta wanting such a large amount of space was important. Partially because they had more control over a large area for natural resources, and partially because Sparta also did not have many other sites for natural resources. A lot of these Greek cities sent out expeditions to create colonies in other parts of the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea. So we'll see that a lot of these cities like Argonusae, Ephesus, and Miletus on the western coast of Turkey, modern-day Turkey, began in the 8th century as colonies of some of these other cities in mainland Greece and on the Peloponnese. Greece also expanded westward, and so southern Italy and the islands of Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia were also major sites of Greek colonies before they were Italian cities. So you can see that the Greeks were really interested because their space was so tight. They were really interested in looking elsewhere for natural resources and other economic support. Sparta had only one colony called Taras that was in South Italy, where some other cities had multiple colonies. So Sparta was more interested in, expanding outwards as much as they could within their own area, as opposed to going overseas and looking for other opportunities for wealth. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the space that Sparta's occupying. So let's get into a little bit more of the questions that we're interested in, so especially how we know what we know about Sparta. So there's quite a bit that we do know about Spartan society. We know about their cultural output, meaning the culture that they created, like their art and their music. We know about their social and economic structures, the ways that they educated boys and girls, marriage customs and their attitudes towards sex and sexuality, how they arranged their government. And from all of that, we're also able to glean some cultural values. And the Pomeroy chapter does a really good job of outlining all of this and really describing for us the ways that Sparta was quite different from some of the other Greek polis and what made it unique in the time that it was in power compared to some of these other places. But there are some complicating factors factors in our understanding of Sparta and how the legend or the reputation of Sparta continued. So the sources we have from Sparta itself are actually not as plentiful as some of our other sources. So we do have some remnants of the pottery that they created. We have some of the poetry that the Spartans created, especially from Alcman and Tyrtaeus. We have remnants of their architecture from their city. And then we have just other artifacts from their daily lives, including things like their weaponry that have been found in other places around the world. But you'll notice that none of this is necessarily martial, meaning not all of this is related to warfare. So pottery itself, before the 5th century BCE, Spartans were more famous for their pottery than anything else. All of this pottery could be found around the Mediterranean world. There was actually quite a lot of it found in the Etruscan culture, which is in northern Italy. So the Spartans were quite famous for their goods, what they were able to produce before they were famous for being warriors. The poetry of Alcman and Tyrtaeus falls under the category of lyric poetry, which is poetry about human emotions and human experiences. So, yes, some of the poetry was about war and warfare, but a lot of it was also about being in love. Or understanding what it means to die, or trying to convince someone to sleep with you, or trying to work through depression. I mean, there's lots of stuff that is related in this poetry that's not just about warfare. The architecture that's left in Sparta, there wasn't much. It wasn't a classically beautiful city. That style of architecture that became famous in Athens wasn't really part of Spartan culture and society. And then, their day-to-day life, their items from their day-to-day life tell us more about how they live. But it's not, exclusive to warfare. So this is in stark contrast to the sources about Sparta that we have from outsiders. And that takes the shape of histories, some collections of sayings, interpretive essays on their way of life, like we read with the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians. And all of that, while it was written in the ancient world, in Greek, most of it was written quite a bit after the heyday, the quote-unquote heyday of the Spartans that we'll talk about next class when we talk about the Persian Wars and the Battle of Thermopylae. And that heyday supposedly was right around 500 BCE, when they were probably at the height of their fame and at the height of their power. But most of these sources really focus on their sort of peculiar way of life and how so much of their society was geared towards producing these incredibly powerful and terrifying and efficient soldiers that the Spartans become famous for. But they really leave out so much of the other aspects of what it means to be a Spartan, and so much of the other contributions that the Spartans made to Greek society. But it does highlight for us this major changeover in Spartan society after the Mycenaean Wars, when the Spartans created this incredibly deep and vast system of slavery that underpinned their economy. So let's take a quick look at what it is that we're trying to understand when we talk about the Spartans. So the first thing is we're trying to understand how the Spartan conquest of Messenia and the Laconian plain affected their development of social and governmental customs and the way they were perceived by outsiders. So we're going to talk a little bit about how creating that vast system of helots, those slaves, and changing over the way that the Spartans produced their own wealth, allowed them to create a very closed society, right? That was admired in a lot of ways, but also kind of led to their own demise and their own failure. The other thing that we want to talk about is how the perception of outsiders affected the way that Western culture understood and continues to understand Spartan values and represent Spartans in our various art forms, including the films that we're going to watch. So the sort of continuation of that first question then is, how do we then understand the Spartans as a society that's been admired and then eventually mythologized? And by mythologized, I mean they have turned into a kind of almost fictional society where we have so many different ideas about who they were, what they valued, and what was admirable about them, but what doesn't necessarily relate to how they actually lived. It's more a figment of our imagination. So that's how we're going to organize our discussion going forward. We're going to leave off here for part 1, and then we'll pick up again for part 2 with a more in-depth look at some of those peculiar aspects of their society and also some descriptions of the way that they fought.